The sun was setting over Pine Grove, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of the suburban neighborhood. Officer James Thompson sat in his patrol car, parked strategically beneath a sprawling oak tree. He'd been on the force for 15 years, and this quiet neighborhood had become his regular beat. The gentle hum of his car's idle mixed with the soft chatter of his police radio, typical end-of-shift sounds he'd grown used to over the years. Thompson sipped his now lukewarm coffee, his eyes automatically scanning each passing car. It was a habit born from years of patrol work, though in this wealthy neighborhood, most days were uneventful. The residents here were mostly business executives, doctors, and lawyers. The houses, with their perfectly trimmed hedges and three-car garages, spoke of privilege and prosperity. His phone buzzed, a text from his wife asking if he'd be home for dinner. As he reached to respond, a gleaming black Range Rover caught his attention. The SUV was immaculate, its windows tinted just dark enough to make him suspicious. Something about it seemed out of place to him in this neighborhood, though he couldn't quite explain why. The vehicle moved smoothly, completely within the speed limit, but Thompson felt an inexplicable urge to run the plates. He watched as the Range Rover made a perfect stop at the intersection, signaled properly, and turned right, everything by the book. Yet his instincts, shaped by years of experience, and though he'd never admit it, deeply rooted prejudices, told him something was off. He straightened in his seat, his coffee forgotten on the dashboard. Thompson's mind started creating scenarios the way cops often do. Maybe it was a drug dealer scoping out the neighborhood, or possibly someone looking for houses to rob. The thoughts came automatically, years of police work mixing with biases he'd developed growing up in a small, homogeneous town. The evening air was growing cooler as Thompson pulled out from his spot, keeping a discreet distance from the Range Rover. He radioed in, his voice casual, "Dispatch, I'm going to conduct a routine check." The dispatcher acknowledged with a crackle of static, and Thompson settled into the familiar rhythm of tailing a vehicle. As they drove through the neighborhood's winding streets, past children playing in their front yards and people walking their dogs, Thompson noticed how the Range Rover's driver seemed to know exactly where they were going. No hesitation at turns, no slow driving while looking at house numbers. Whoever was behind the wheel was familiar with these streets. His dashboard computer blinked with the start of his final hour on shift. Thompson knew he should probably head back to the station to complete his daily paperwork, but something kept him following this vehicle. The sun had dipped lower now, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange, making the tinted windows of the Range Rover appear even darker. The vehicle ahead maintained perfect driving etiquette, precise speed, proper signaling, respectful stops. In fact, the more Thompson followed, the more he realized there was absolutely nothing suspicious about the driving. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling, the prejudgment that had taken root the moment he first spotted the luxury SUV. Looking back later, Thompson would recognize this moment as the beginning of something significant, though he had no way of knowing it then. For now, he was just a cop following his instincts, even if those instincts were about to lead him into a situation that would change his perspective forever. As the Range Rover made another turn onto Maple Street, Thompson decided it was time to make his move. His finger hovered over the lights control, his mind already rehearsing the routine he'd performed countless times before. What he didn't realize was that this stop would be anything but routine, and the next few minutes would shake the very foundation of his worldview. The street lamps were just starting to flicker on, casting pools of yellow light on the pavement. Thompson took a deep breath, years of training and experience settling into his muscles. He was about to initiate a stop that would start as a regular end-of-shift interaction, but would end up becoming a pivotal moment in his career and his life. Thompson flicked on his patrol car's lights, and the Range Rover responded immediately, pulling over smoothly to the curb. The luxury SUV's brake lights glowed red in the growing darkness, reflecting off the wet pavement from an earlier spring shower. He noticed how the driver chose a well-lit spot under a street lamp, something experienced people often did during traffic stops. Following procedure, Thompson radioed in his location to dispatch. He took an extra moment in his car, a habit he developed over years of traffic stops. Through his windshield, he could see the driver's silhouette, hands clearly visible on the steering wheel. Another sign this person was familiar with proper protocol during police stops. The sound of car doors shutting from nearby houses caught his attention. Residents were coming home from work, some pausing to watch the scene unfold. Thompson felt a flutter of self-consciousness but pushed it aside. He'd convinced himself this stop was necessary, even though deep down he knew he had no real probable cause. As he approached the Range Rover, his right hand instinctively hovered near his weapon, a habit born from academy training and reinforced by years on the force. The tinted windows made him especially cautious, though their darkness was well within legal limits. His flashlight beam bounced off the pristine black paint, revealing a vehicle that probably cost more than his annual salary. The evening air had grown cooler, carrying the scent of blooming spring flowers from nearby gardens. Thompson's boots crunched on small pieces of gravel as he reached the driver's window. He noticed high-end rims, spotless detailing, and a small silver emblem from an exclusive country club on the back window. Details that should have told him something about the owner, but somehow only reinforced his preconceptions. Standing slightly behind the driver's door for safety, Thompson tapped on the window with his flashlight. The window hummed as it lowered smoothly, releasing the faint scent of expensive leather interior. Thompson's flashlight beam revealed a man in his 50s wearing what appeared to be a tailored suit. A sleek briefcase sat in the passenger seat beside a folded copy of that morning's newspaper. "Good evening, sir," the driver spoke first, his voice steady and professionally cordial. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" The question was posed politely but with an underlying confidence that momentarily threw Thompson off balance. He was used to nervous energy from drivers, not this calm self-assurance. Thompson cleared his throat, suddenly aware he hadn't actually prepared a valid reason for the stop. "I noticed your vehicle making some irregular movements," he said, the lie feeling thick in his mouth. "License and registration, please." He kept his tone authoritative, compensating for his uncertainty with an edge of aggression that wasn't necessary. The driver's hands moved slowly and deliberately, reaching first for the glove compartment. "Of course, officer. I'll get those for you right now." His movements were measured, almost like he was teaching a masterclass in how to behave during a traffic stop. "Would you like me to narrate what I'm doing as I reach for my documents?" Something about the man's composed demeanor made Thompson increasingly uneasy. This wasn't going the way traffic stops usually went. The driver seemed too comfortable, too familiar with procedure. Thompson's flashlight beam remained steady, but his confidence was wavering. "Just move slowly," Thompson replied, his voice carrying a gruffness he usually reserved for suspicious situations. But what exactly was suspicious here? A well-maintained vehicle? A well-dressed driver? Professional courtesy? His own discomfort began to grow as these questions crept into his mind. The interior light of the Range Rover illuminated the cabin as the driver retrieved his documents. Thompson could now see the immaculate condition of the vehicle's interior, the subtle gleam of what looked like a high-end watch on the driver's wrist, and a phone mount holding the latest iPhone model. Everything spoke of success and legitimate wealth. "Here you are, officer," the driver said, extending his credentials with a steady hand. "I believe you'll find everything in order." There was something in his tone, not quite amusement, not quite challenge, that made Thompson's pulse quicken slightly. It was almost as if the driver was waiting for something, anticipating a specific reaction. As Thompson reached for the documents, a car passing by illuminated the interior of the Range Rover more clearly. In that brief moment, he caught a glimpse of something on the passenger seat beneath the newspaper, the corner of what looked like a familiar department folder, the kind used for official police business. Thompson's hand froze halfway to the extended documents, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. The driver's calm demeanor, his familiarity with procedure, the official folder, pieces of a puzzle were rapidly clicking into place, and the picture they were forming made his stomach tighten with apprehension. Standing there in the growing darkness, Officer Thompson was about to learn a lesson about assumptions that would stay with him for the rest of his career. As his fingers finally closed around the offered credentials, he had no idea that this routine traffic stop was about to become one of the most significant moments of his life. The credentials in Thompson's hand felt unusually heavy as his flashlight beam settled on them. His throat went dry as he processed what he was seeing, not just a driver's license, but a police chief's badge and ID. The gold badge caught the light, seeming to mock his earlier assumptions. "Is there a problem, Officer Thompson?" The driver's voice carried a quiet authority that made Thompson's spine straighten automatically. Chief Robert Williams. The name on the ID matched the announcement he'd skimmed in last month's department memo. The same Chief Williams who'd been appointed to lead their department after an impressive 30-year career in law enforcement. The night suddenly felt much colder. Thompson's flashlight beam wavered slightly as he double-checked the credentials, though he already knew they were authentic. He'd seen the chief's photo in department emails, but somehow hadn't connected it until this moment. The realization of what he'd done, profiling his own chief, hit him like a physical blow. "Sir, Thompson started, but his words trailed off. What could he say? That he'd pulled over an expensive vehicle because he'd made assumptions about who should be driving it. That he'd fabricated a reason for the stop based on nothing but his own prejudices. Chief Williams remained silent, letting the moment stretch. His calm demeanor hadn't changed, but there was now an undeniable weight to his presence. Through the open window, Thompson could hear the soft tick of the Range Rover's cooling engine and distant children playing in their yards, ordinary sounds that felt surreal in this extraordinary moment. "Would you like to tell me the real reason you pulled me over?" Chief Williams asked, his voice level but firm. It wasn't really a question. There was no accusation in his tone, which somehow made it worse. He was giving Thompson enough rope to either hang himself or pull himself to safety. Thompson shifted his weight, acutely aware of how his hand had been resting near his weapon earlier. The same weapon he carried to protect and serve, words that now felt hollow in light of his actions. A bead of sweat rolled down his back despite the cool evening air. "I made an assumption, sir," Thompson finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The words felt like gravel in his mouth, but they were the truth. "I saw the vehicle and I made assumptions I shouldn't have made." Chief Williams nodded slowly, as if he'd heard this explanation many times before. "And what assumptions were those, Officer Thompson?" Again, his tone remained professional, almost educational. He wasn't just asking questions, he was leading Thompson through a painful but necessary self-examination. The sounds of the neighborhood continued around them. A dog barking in the distance, a car door slamming somewhere down the street, the rustle of trees in the evening breeze. These normal sounds felt like a stark contrast to the profound moment unfolding between these two men. "I assumed," Thompson paused, the full weight of his actions settling on his shoulders. "I assumed that someone who looked like you shouldn't." He couldn't finish the sentence, the words sticking in his throat as he realized how they would sound spoken aloud. "Couldn't live in this neighborhood, shouldn't drive this kind of car." Chief Williams finished for him, his words carrying decades of similar experiences. "Let me guess, you thought I might be casing houses, or maybe dealing drugs." There was no anger in his voice, just a deep wariness that spoke of countless similar encounters. Thompson felt his face burning with shame. The chief's calm recitation of his unspoken assumptions made them sound even more ridiculous and prejudiced than they had in his head. He'd been on the force for 15 years, had attended diversity training, had even prided himself on being one of the good ones. Yet here he was, caught in the act of the very behavior he claimed to stand against. "Sir, I apologize. I know that's not enough, but," Thompson began, but Chief Williams held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Officer Thompson, I didn't achieve this position by accident," the chief said, gesturing to his badge that Thompson still held. "I worked my way up through the ranks, facing these exact situations more times than I care to count. Even in uniform, even as a detective, even as a captain, there were always those who saw my skin color before they saw my badge." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth. Thompson stood there, still holding the chief's credentials, feeling like he was seeing his own behavior clearly for the first time. The routine traffic stop he'd initiated had transformed into something far more significant, a mirror showing him reflections of himself he'd never wanted to acknowledge. "What happens now, sir?" Thompson asked, his voice steadier than he felt. He knew his career could end right here, with one word from the man sitting in the Range Rover. The thought sent a chill down his spine, not just for his job, but for what it would mean for his family. Chief Williams took a moment before responding, his eyes studying Thompson's face as if searching for something. The street lamps cast shadows across both their faces, a reminder of the growing darkness around them and the darker realities they were confronting. Chief Williams turned off his engine, a subtle signal that this conversation wasn't going to be brief. The clicking of the cooling motor filled the silence between them. Thompson stood rooted to the spot, still holding the chief's credentials, his flashlight beam now pointed awkwardly at the ground. "Get in your car, Officer Thompson," Chief Williams said quietly. "Follow me to the coffee shop around the corner. I think we need to have a conversation." It wasn't a request, but it wasn't delivered as a harsh command either. The words carried the weight of experience, of someone who had been on both sides of the situation. 5 minutes later, they sat in a quiet corner of the local coffee shop. The evening rush had passed, leaving only a few customers scattered among the tables. The smell of coffee and freshly baked cookies created an oddly normal backdrop for what felt like the most surreal moment of Thompson's career. Chief Williams set his coffee down, watching the steam rise. He'd removed his suit jacket, revealing a crisp white shirt and a tie that probably cost more than Thompson's entire uniform. But it wasn't the clothes that commanded attention. It was the presence of the man himself, the quiet dignity that seemed to fill the space around him. 32 years ago, the chief began, his voice low but clear. "I was a rookie officer, just like you once were. First day on patrol, in full uniform, I stopped at a convenience store to buy a coffee. The owner called 911 to report a suspicious person in a stolen police uniform. He paused, letting the words sink in. That was my introduction to what it meant to be a black officer." Thompson stared into his own coffee, untouched and growing cold. The shame he'd felt earlier was transforming into something else, a dawning understanding that made his chest tight. "Sir, I don't know what to say," Thompson managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't need to say anything right now," Chief Williams replied. "You need to listen, because what happened tonight isn't just about you and me. It's about every traffic stop, every interaction, every split-second decision we make as officers." The chief pulled out his phone, scrolling through photos before stopping on one. He turned it toward Thompson. The image showed a younger version of himself in SWAT gear, leading a team during what appeared to be a major operation. "This was 15 years ago. I was the SWAT commander, responding to a bank robbery. When I arrived on scene, a junior officer tried to stop me from entering the command post. He was convinced I couldn't be in charge." Chief Williams shook his head, a sad smile crossing his face. "Even with all the tactical gear, the radio, the insignia, all he saw was the color of my skin." Thompson felt each word like a physical blow. How many times had he done the same thing? How many times had he let his first glance, his initial assumption, override everything else? "The hardest part," Chief Williams continued, "isn't the obvious racism. It's the subtle things, the surprise on people's faces when they learn your rank, the way some officers tense up when you enter a room, the extra second of hesitation before following an order." He leaned forward slightly. "The way an officer might follow a car just because it seems out of place in a certain neighborhood." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Through the coffee shop's windows, Thompson could see his patrol car parked next to the chief's Range Rover, two vehicles that told very different stories about their owners, or so he had assumed. "You have choices to make, Officer Thompson," the chief said, his tone shifting slightly. "Not just about tonight, but about every night going forward. Every traffic stop, every interaction, every assumption." Thompson finally looked up from his coffee, meeting the chief's gaze. "What happens now, sir?" "I know I deserve whatever disciplinary action." Chief Williams held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "If I wanted to end your career, we wouldn't be sitting here having coffee. I've seen your record, Thompson. You're a good officer in many ways, but being good isn't enough anymore. We need to be better." The evening crowd had thinned even more, leaving them almost alone in their corner. The barista was wiping down counters, soft music played overhead, and two men in law enforcement uniforms sat having a conversation that could change both their lives. "I'm going to give you an opportunity," Chief Williams said, pulling a business card from his wallet. "There's a program I helped develop at the academy. It's about understanding bias, not just talking about it. Real stories, real consequences, real change." He slid the card across the table. "I want you to be part of it. Not as a student, but as someone who can speak from experience about this moment right here. Thompson stared at the card, its embossed letters catching the light. This wasn't the punishment he'd expected. It was something far more challenging, a chance to confront his own biases head-on and help others do the same. Why? Thompson asked, his voice cracking slightly. Why give me this chance? Chief Williams stood up, picking up his suit jacket. Because 32 years ago, someone gave me a chance to prove that their assumptions about me were wrong. Sometimes, Officer Thompson, the best way to fight prejudice is to help people see it in themselves. The next morning, Thompson arrived at the station an hour early, the events of the previous night still weighing heavily on his mind. The business card Chief Williams had given him sat on his desk, its edges already worn from how many times he'd picked it up and read it over. The precinct was quiet, with only a few early shift officers preparing for their day. Thompson had barely slept, replaying the traffic stop over and over in his mind. Each time he saw something new. Another assumption. Another moment of bias he hadn't recognized before. Morning, Thompson called Officer Chen, his partner for the past 3 years. You're in early. Thompson managed a weak smile but didn't respond. How many times had he and Chen discussed traffic stops? How many decisions had they justified with instinct or experience when it was really something else entirely? As he sorted through his paperwork, Thompson's attention kept drifting to the photos on his desk. His wife and kids smiled back at him from their frames. He thought about his son, 12 years old and dreaming of becoming a police officer. What kind of example was he setting? What kind of world was he helping to create? The station gradually came to life around him, phones ringing, radios crackling, officers coming and going. But Thompson remained at his desk, deep in thought, until Chief Williams's voice cut through the morning bustle. Officer Thompson, my office, please. The walk to the chief's office felt longer than usual. Every step was heavy with the knowledge that his fellow officers would be wondering about this early morning summons. The chief's office, with its glass walls, meant that conversation would be visible to everyone, even if not audible. Inside, Chief Williams sat behind his desk, looking fresh and composed despite the previous night's events. The morning sun streaming through the windows highlighted the silver in his hair earned through decades of service. Files were spread across his desk. Thompson recognized his own personnel file among them. Have a seat, the chief said, gesturing to a chair. I assume you didn't get much sleep last night. Thompson sat down, his uniform feeling unusually stiff. No, sir, I had a lot to think about. Good, Chief Williams nodded. That's exactly what I hoped would happen. He picked up one of the files. I've been reviewing your record. 7 years ago, you received a commendation for talking down an armed suspect without using force. The report says you took the time to listen, to understand the situation before acting. Thompson remembered that day clearly. A young man with a gun, more scared than dangerous. He'd seen past the weapon to the person holding it. That's the kind of police work we need, the chief continued. The ability to see beyond our first impressions, to look deeper than our initial reactions. He paused, letting the words sink in. But that skill shouldn't be selective, should it? The question hung in the air between them. Thompson thought about how differently he'd approached those two situations, the armed suspect and last night's traffic stop. One had earned him a commendation, the other had revealed his prejudices. I've been doing this job for 15 years, Thompson said slowly, and until last night, I thought I was doing it right. I thought I was one of the good ones. His voice cracked slightly on the last words. Chief Williams leaned forward. That's the problem with bias, Officer Thompson. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wave a flag and declare its presence. It hides in our assumptions, disguises itself as experience, and whispers to us that it's just good police work. The morning sunlight shifted, casting shadows across the office. Outside, life at the precinct continued. Officers heading out on patrol, detectives arriving with coffee cups in hand, the everyday rhythm of law enforcement. I want you to attend our bias training session this weekend, Chief Williams said. Not as a participant, but as a speaker. Share what happened last night. Share what you're feeling right now. He held up a hand as Thompson started to protest. Your story is powerful precisely because you're not a bad cop. You're someone who thought he was doing everything right. Thompson felt his chest tighten. The thought of standing in front of his fellow officers, admitting his mistakes, was terrifying. But wasn't that fear exactly what Chief Williams had been talking about? The need to confront uncomfortable truths. There's something else, the chief continued, pulling another file from his desk. I'm putting you on a special assignment. You'll be working with our community outreach program, specifically in neighborhoods where we've had tensions with residents. Your experience, both as an officer and from last night, makes you uniquely qualified. Thompson stared at the file, understanding dawning. This wasn't punishment, it was an opportunity for real change. Not just for him, but for the department and the community. Why me? He asked, echoing his question from the coffee shop. After what I did. Because you're ready to learn, Chief Williams replied simply. Because you're feeling the weight of your actions and wanting to do better. That's where real change begins, not from shame, but from understanding and the desire to improve. As Thompson left the office, carrying the community outreach file and the weight of his new responsibilities, he felt something he hadn't expected: hope. Not the easy hope of someone who thinks they have all the answers, but the challenging hope of someone who has finally started asking the right questions. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as Thompson stood at the podium. 2 weeks had passed since that life-changing traffic stop, and here he was, facing a room full of fellow officers for the bias training session. His uniform felt tight around his neck, and his hands were slightly shaky as he adjusted the microphone. I've been a police officer for 15 years, he began, his voice steadier than he felt. And 2 weeks ago, I learned I wasn't the officer I thought I was. He could see the confusion on some faces, the curiosity on others. In the back of the room, Chief Williams nodded encouragingly. I pulled over a vehicle because, Thompson paused, forcing himself to be honest, because I didn't think the driver belonged in that neighborhood. Because I made assumptions based on nothing but my own prejudices. The room grew quieter, officers leaning forward in their chairs. As Thompson shared the story, he watched his colleagues' reactions. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps recognizing their own behaviors. Others sat very still, their expressions unreadable. But they were all listening, really listening. When I realized I had pulled over our new chief, a murmur ran through the room. I thought my career was over. Instead, I learned the most important lesson of my life. Thompson looked directly at his fellow officers. We all have biases. The question is, are we brave enough to admit them and work to change them? After the session, Officer Chen approached him in the parking lot. That took guts, he said, leaning against his patrol car. Made me think about some of my own stops. They stood in silence for a moment, both understanding that their partnership would be different now, hopefully better. The following week, Thompson started his new assignment with community outreach. His first meeting was at a local high school, where he found himself facing 30 teenagers, most from neighborhoods he previously viewed with suspicion. I'm not here to tell you all cops are perfect, he told them honestly. I'm here because we need to do better, and that starts with admitting when we're wrong. The students, initially distant and skeptical, began to engage. One boy raised his hand, sharing a story about being followed in stores. A girl talked about her father being pulled over 3 times in 1 month. Thompson listened, really listened, the way Chief Williams had listened to him that night. Each story added another crack to his old way of thinking, letting in more light, more understanding. During his regular patrols, Thompson began to see things differently. The suspicious group of young men on the corner became teenagers heading home from basketball practice. The out-of-place car in a wealthy neighborhood became a healthcare worker visiting a patient. One evening, he spotted a rookie officer following a car in a way that seemed all too familiar. Thompson radioed in. "Hey, Roberts, got a minute? Let's grab coffee." At the local diner, over steaming cups, Thompson shared his story again. The rookie's initial defensiveness slowly gave way to understanding. But how do we know when it's real suspicion and when it's bias? Roberts asked, echoing Thompson's own earlier struggles. We ask ourselves the hard questions, Thompson replied. Would we find this suspicious if the person looked different? Are we seeing actual suspicious behavior, or are we seeing what we expect to see? The changes weren't always dramatic. Sometimes they were small moments, a different approach to a traffic stop, a longer pause before making assumptions, a willingness to question his first impressions. But those small moments added up, creating a ripple effect through the department. Chief Williams noticed. During their weekly meetings, Thompson shared both successes and challenges. The chief listened, offered guidance, and occasionally shared his own experiences from 3 decades of breaking down barriers. "You're not just changing yourself," the chief told him one afternoon. "You're changing the culture, one conversation at a time." He gestured to a stack of requests on his desk. "Other precincts are asking about our training program. They want to hear your story." Thompson thought about that scared officer from 2 weeks ago, the one who'd pulled over his chief out of prejudice. He was still that officer in some ways, still learning, still making mistakes. But he was also becoming someone new, someone better. 1 month after the traffic stop, Thompson sat in his patrol car, watching the sun set over his beat. His phone buzzed with a text from his wife. "Don't forget, career day at Tommy's school tomorrow." He smiled, thinking about how different his speech would be this year. He had a new story to tell, not just about being a police officer, but about being a better human being. A car drove past, and Thompson noticed his old instincts kicking in. But now, instead of acting on them, he paused. He asked himself the hard questions. He remembered Chief Williams's words about choices and changes. And he made a different decision, one small moment at a time, one choice at a time, becoming the officer he should have been all along. 6 months later, Thompson stood at the front of a packed auditorium at the police academy. The audience wasn't just local officers anymore. There were representatives from departments across the state, all eager to hear about the program that was making headlines in law enforcement journals. "Real change," Thompson began, his voice confident now after months of sharing his story, "doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens in thousands of small decisions we make every day." He no longer needed notes to tell his story. He lived it every day. In the front row, Chief Williams sat with a group of police chiefs from neighboring cities. The program they developed together had grown beyond their initial expectations. What started as one officer's mistake and another's wisdom had evolved into something much bigger. 6 months ago, I thought I was one of the good ones," Thompson continued, making eye contact with the new recruits in the audience. "I followed procedures. I wrote clean reports. I treated people with what I thought was respect. But I was missing something fundamental, the ability to see my own biases." The presentation screen behind him showed statistics from their department. Complaints down by 40%, community engagement up by 60%, improved response times in all neighborhoods. But the numbers didn't tell the whole story. The real changes were in the daily interactions, the small moments that added up to transformed relationships. After the presentation, a young officer approached Thompson. "I used to think these training sessions were just about checking boxes," she admitted. "But hearing your story, it makes it real." Thompson recognized the look in her eyes, the same awakening he'd experienced that night with Chief Williams. Back at his precinct, the changes were visible everywhere. The community outreach program had expanded, with officers regularly attending neighborhood events, not just as security, but as participants. Local residents who once viewed police with suspicion now stopped by the station to share concerns or sometimes just to talk. Thompson's partner, Chen, had become an advocate for change himself. Together, they developed a mentoring program for rookie officers, teaching them to question their assumptions before acting on them. Their patrol car became known as the Thinking Car, a place where officers could discuss difficult situations and examine their own biases. One afternoon, Thompson responded to a call at the same coffee shop where he'd had that crucial conversation with Chief Williams. The owner, an elderly man, was having trouble with some teenagers hanging around outside. 6 months ago, Thompson might have approached with authority and suspicion. Instead, he took time to listen. It turned out the teens were aspiring artists looking for a place to display their work. Within an hour, Thompson had helped broker a deal. The kids would get wall space for their art, and the coffee shop would get new customers. A potential confrontation became a community connection. Chief Williams dropped by during the first art showing. "This is what real police work looks like," he said, watching the proud young artists explain their work to customers. Not just responding to problems, but preventing them through understanding. The changes spread beyond their department. Other precincts began sending officers to observe their approach. Community leaders from different cities came to learn how they'd transformed the relationship between police and residents. Thompson's story became part of a larger conversation about reform and human connection. At home, Thompson noticed changes in himself as a father. His son, now 13, asked more questions about his work. Instead of giving simplified answers, Thompson shared the complexities, the challenges, and the importance of always being willing to learn and grow. 1 year after the traffic stop that changed everything, Thompson sat in his patrol car at the same spot where he'd first seen Chief Williams's Range Rover. The neighborhood hadn't changed. Same houses, same streets, same mix of people coming and going. But his view of it had transformed completely. A luxury car drove past and Thompson smiled, remembering his old assumptions. His radio crackled with a call, and he responded with a new awareness that had become second nature. Each interaction was an opportunity, not just to enforce the law, but to build understanding. As he drove through his beat, Thompson reflected on how far they'd come. The department had changed, yes, but more importantly, individuals had changed. Officers learned to pause before acting on assumptions. Community members began to see police as humans, capable of both mistakes and growth. Trust, once broken, was slowly being rebuilt. Chief Williams still kept the department's door open for anyone wanting to learn from their experience. Change is like a pebble in a pond, he often said. The ripples keep spreading long after the initial splash. Thompson thought about all the officers who'd heard his story, all the communities that had benefited from their new approach, all the potential confrontations that had become conversations instead. One traffic stop, one moment of truth, one choice to learn rather than defend. It had started a movement that continued to grow. As the sun set on another day of patrol, Thompson knew that their work wasn't finished. Biases don't disappear overnight, and trust takes time to build. But every day brought new opportunities to make better choices, to see people more clearly, to serve with greater understanding. And that, he had learned, was what real change looked like.